Paul Mason. Well, joining me now from Dartmouth College in the United States is the former Bank of England MPC member David Blanchard. Flower from Washington by Diana Furchtgott-Roth, who was a chief economic advisor under George W. Bush. And here in the studio by Matthew Hancock MP, who until last year was an advisor to George Osborne. First of all, Professor Blanchflower, are you concerned that this rush to gold is an indication of deep continuing problems in the US economy in particular?
Well, I think it's worries about the global economy. I think the world is looking pretty volatile in some ways now. Growth is really very patchy, and I think investors are starting to think you need to diversify your portfolio, and there's clear worries that we're going to see inflation because fiscal tightening on the one hand means that central banks have got to keep their feet down on the monetary trigger. So in some sense it's a hedge, but I think it certainly does mean that the world economy is looking quite vulnerable.
Diana Furchtgott, do you think it's an indication that there's serious health problems still in the US economy, and that what's happening at the moment is that not enough is being done, in a sense, to nail how that deficit is going to be cut?
That's absolutely right. It's not only the price of gold that's rising, but also the price of oil, price of copper, other minerals. All these dollar-denominated assets are going up in price because the value of the dollar is going down. Why is the value of the dollar going down? Because of Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke's quantitative easing, because of the large amount of liquidity, and fundamentally because Ben Bernanke is trying to stimulate the U.S. economy because the fiscal situation is so poor, because the budget situation is so poor, and so the dollar is losing in value.
But Professor Blanchard, isn't this as much about confidence? I mean, you know, the U.S. has got growth, but even though the growth is there, it's not seen by people in such a way as they can trust the growth.
Well, growth is quite strong relative to the growth in the UK, but the other commentator is quite right. The big worry is that the central banks have to keep this stimulus going. That's what rescued us from this situation, and we have this dilemma. On the one hand, fiscally, the revenues aren't coming in. We have to keep monetary policy going, and growth is really unstable and low in many countries. And the reason is this is a great financial crisis that hasn't been fixed and is continuing. And the mistake much of the world has made is to think it was all over, and it isn't at all.
But Matthew Hancock,
banks are absolutely not lending.
Yeah, if it isn't all over, Matthew, then presumably, if you look at this rush to gold, you think the deficit's perhaps not been cut fast enough. Perhaps in this country it's not been cut fast enough.
Well, what the increase in the price of gold shows more than anything is the amount of uncertainty in the economy and around the world. And one of the things that I think we need to do to reduce that uncertainty is to get a grip on the fiscal situation, to make sure that we can live within our means as a country. And we can see from the outliers in Europe, from Portugal and Ireland, what happens if you don't have a credible plan to get to grip with your fiscal situation. So actually, in this debate, the risk is not getting the risky thing to do would be not to get a grip. And in the UK, I think we've reduced that risk by having a credible plan. And in America, it was very interesting. I was there over the last couple of weeks, and they have finally, all parties now agree that there need to be cuts, and they're starting to say that there is that they need to act.
Professor Blanchard, have you lost the argument against cuts then, do you think, Professor Blanchard?
Well, I don't agree with anything that Mr. Hancock said, actually. I think the evidence is actually that fiscal contractions are not expansionary. That's what we've seen so far. Every country in Europe that actually is doing it, Ireland, Greece, Portugal, the UK, Iceland, all gone into negative growth in Q4 2010. As Larry Summers said over the weekend, the idea of actually having a contraction which generates expansion is oxymoronic. There's no evidence whatsoever around the world that these expansions have generated growth. What they've done is compromise growth. So actually, Mr. Hancock is completely wrong. That's why central bankers have to keep interest rates down, because the fiscal authorities are doing exactly the wrong thing.
Well, actually, Danny was actually, but Danny was
I'm going to come to you, Diana, in a moment. Yes, Michael Hancock.
Right.
Matthew Hancock.
That's right.
Actually, Danny was right at the start when he said that the increase in the price of gold shows the uncertainty around the world, and I think you'd agree with that. And one of the major uncertainties is that the crisis in the banking system has now become a crisis in sovereign debt, in nations, and we need to show that we can deal with that. Because it's all very well to say we must keep pumping up the bubble and keep spending to keep growing, but it doesn't work if the risk that you take when you try that path is a catastrophic default or a close to default, as we've seen in some euro areas.
Diana, to you now.
Well, we have had uncertainty before, such as in 2008, and the price of gold was not as high then. What's happened is the faith in the dollar is deteriorating because of the picture of debt. And it's true that both parties, Republicans and Democrats, agree that we need to reduce our budget deficit, but they are not very close on how to do it. President Obama attacked the leading Republican, Paul Ryan, the House Budget Committee chairman, for his plan, which would cut $6 trillion. And President Obama doesn't really have a plan to make cuts. And the two parties are very far apart. That's why Standard & Poor's has just warned the United States about possibly downgrading our AAA debt status.
Professor Blanchard, do you really think that Obama has got the wrong plan at the moment?
No, I think the big difference, let's just go with the difference. In the UK, what the government has done is actually cut too quickly and too deeply. What's happened in the United States is that there's an ongoing discussion, again as your commentator said, an ongoing discussion between the political parties about what they're going to do about 2 years hence. There's no sense in which they're actually doing it.
But that would be true. That would be true. But they've just announced. Hold on. In the United States, 2 weeks ago, all parties agreed to a $38 billion cut in the budget. And Obama's plan, actually, over the next 4 years, goes very slightly faster than the government's plan here.
But that's it's on a different mechanism, because you're reducing the deficit as a percentage of GDP, and that's not by growth. The problem for you guys is that next Wednesday, you've your GDP figures. And what if your GDP figures are down below 2.2% or 2.1%?
Do you know, the risk would be if we didn't deal with the deficit, because in Portugal, where they didn't effectively and set out a credible plan, interest rates rose to over 10%. And look, I've just come here from a meeting of small business people in Suffolk, and imagine the negative impact on them if interest rates here got to 10% as they have in Portugal.
But
that is the risk. That's the risk that's being taken if we don't deal with our debt.
No, that's completely not true. Well, no one's argued that you shouldn't deal...
Yeah, Professor Blanchard.
No one's argued that you shouldn't be dealing with the deficit. The question is, how quickly do you deal with it? There's no likelihood, as Mr. Hancock said, of interest rates being 10%. The US is talking about dealing with the deficit in a 10-year period, not in 4. So the problem in the UK is cutting too fast and compromising growth. And as Kirsty says, next week we're going to get a pretty bad number. So that's the problem.
Well, Diana Furchtgott, briefly, what has to happen imminently? What has to happen imminently to restore confidence?
Imminently, to restore confidence, I think that the Republicans and Democrats have to agree on a budget that does cut this next fiscal year. But what's happening imminently is a vote on raising the American debt ceiling. And in order to do that, Republicans say they want serious cuts. Democrats say no, they don't want these cuts. So we are going to be at an impasse in perhaps 2 or 3 weeks over this debt ceiling increase.
Thank you all very much indeed. Well, the Queen's gift of Monday money